Sloane needs the seat more than you do tonight. Graham Holloway said it quietly, almost casually, as if he were asking his ex-wife to pass the salt instead of giving her place at a charity gala to the woman he had betrayed her with. Alyssa Carter stopped beside table 7, one hand still resting on the back of the chair. Her name was printed on the ivory place card in front of Sloane Mercer. Alyssa Carter. Black lettering. Gold border. Nothing dramatic about it. Just one small detail that was completely wrong. Sloane was sitting in her chair. Graham stood behind her in a black tuxedo, one hand on Sloane's shoulder, looking perfectly comfortable beneath the warm chandeliers of the Manhattan ballroom. Around them, donors laughed over champagne, waiters moved between tables, and a string quartet played something soft enough to make the whole room feel expensive. Alyssa looked at the card, then at Graham. "That's my seat." Graham's jaw tightened slightly. "I know." That hurt more than if he had pretended it was a mistake. Alyssa felt heat climb into her face. Not embarrassment exactly. Something older. Something familiar. The same feeling she used to get when Graham dismissed her ideas at dinner, then repeated them at work the next morning like they had come from him. Sloane picked up the place card between two fingers and glanced at Alyssa's name. "I hope you don't mind," she said. Her smile was polite in the way only cruel smiles can be polite. "Graham said I should be closer to the investors." Alyssa waited for him to correct her. He didn't. Instead, Graham leaned toward Alyssa and lowered his voice. "There's another seat in the back. Table 14. You'll be fine there." Fine. For 6 years of marriage, that word had covered a lot. Alyssa had been fine when he missed their anniversary for a deal dinner. Fine when his phone started living face down on the kitchen counter. Fine when Sloane's name appeared too often in conversations that supposedly had nothing to do with her. Fine when Graham finally admitted there was someone else and somehow managed to make his betrayal sound like a business decision. "We grew into different worlds," he had told her. Tonight, apparently, those worlds had assigned seating. Alyssa looked around. Several people nearby had noticed. No one stared directly, but conversations had softened. A woman at the next table suddenly became very interested in her wine glass. Graham hated public scenes. He was counting on Alyssa hating them more. He was right, but not for the reason he thought. Alyssa reached past Sloane, lifted the place card from the table, and slipped it into her clutch. "Enjoy the seat," she said. Graham blinked. He had expected anger. Maybe tears. At least a question. Alyssa gave him none of it. A young event coordinator hurried over, apologizing as she offered to escort Alyssa to table 14 near the service doors. Alyssa followed without looking back. Graham watched her leave and let out the breath he had been holding. To him, her silence meant surrender. What he did not know was that Alyssa had spent the last 14 months working quietly with the very foundation hosting this gala. He did not know why the chairman had personally asked whether she would attend. And he definitely did not know whose family name was waiting on the final slide of the donor presentation. Graham thought he had just moved his ex-wife to the back of the room. Before the night was over, the entire ballroom would learn that Alyssa Carter had never needed his permission to have a seat at the table. Table 14 sat near the back wall, close enough to the service doors that Alyssa could hear plates being stacked in the hallway behind her. Graham would have hated the location. That thought almost made her smile. Almost. The event coordinator pulled out a chair and whispered, "I am really sorry about the mix-up." Alyssa looked at her. The young woman seemed more embarrassed than anyone who had actually caused the problem. "You did not create the mix-up," Alyssa said. "You are fine." She sat down and placed her clutch beside her plate. Across the ballroom, Graham was already talking to two men from a private equity firm. His posture relaxed again, as if the problem had been handled. That was how he had always liked conflict. Quietly moved somewhere he did not have to look at it. For years earlier, Northstar Vale Partners had been nothing more than a rented office, 3 employees, and a logo. Graham had changed 6 times because none of them looked important enough. Alyssa still remembered those nights in their apartment in Brooklyn, long before the tailored tuxedos and donor walls. Graham would spread financial models across the dining table while she sat beside him with a laptop, rewriting the parts of his pitch that sounded cold. "Investors do not only want to know how much money you can make," she told him once. "They want to know why anyone should trust you with it." Graham had rubbed both hands over his face. "You make it sound easy. It is not easy. That is why you keep making me fix it." He had laughed then, a real laugh. He had kissed the top of her head and said, "When this works, It is going to be because of both of us. Alyssa had believed him. She had also made one phone call he never knew about. Not to ask for money. Never money. She called an old associate of her father and asked if he would sit through Graham's presentation. Just once. No promises. No favors after that. The meeting became an introduction. The introduction became another meeting. North Star Vale survived its first year. Graham thought persistence had finally opened the right door. Alyssa let him think that because she wanted his confidence to belong to him. She never wanted him wondering whether people saw Graham Holloway or Marcus Carter's son-in-law. But success changed the questions Graham asked. At first it was, do you think this deal works? Then it became, are you really wearing that? Later, why do you never want to come to these dinners? Alyssa did go sometimes. She just did not enjoy spending 3 hours watching people calculate one another's usefulness before dessert. Graham did. He became good at it. Too good. One night, after a networking event, he loosened his tie in the elevator and said, "Sometimes I need a wife who understands how these rooms work." Alyssa had stared at the glowing floor numbers above the door. She could have told him that half the room knew her father. She could have told him the host had sent her mother flowers every Christmas for 20 years. Instead, she asked, "What do you think I do not understand?" Graham sighed like she was making things difficult. "You just do not have that instinct." Months later, Sloane appeared. First as a name in conversation. Then as someone Graham called sharp. Then connected. Then someone who apparently understood the rooms Alyssa did not. By the time the marriage ended, Graham had rewritten their entire history into something cleaner for himself. He told her they had grown into different worlds. Alyssa had signed the divorce papers without correcting him. Now, sitting at table 14, she looked across the ballroom at the world he had been so desperate to enter. Graham still did not know the truth. He had spent years trying to climb into a circle that had known Alyssa Carter long before anyone knew his name. By the time the first course arrived, Alyssa had stopped thinking about Graham altogether. Table 14 turned out to be quieter than the front of the ballroom, but it was also warmer in a way money could not manufacture. To her left sat Dr. Leonard Hayes, a pediatric cardiologist with silver hair and a habit of folding his napkin into perfect squares. Across from her were Rachel and Ben Morrison, a couple from Queens who looked slightly overwhelmed by the chandeliers, the cameras, and the price tags being whispered around the room. "First Gala?" Alyssa asked when Rachel nearly reached for the wrong fork and caught herself. Rachel laughed under her breath. "Is it that obvious?" "Only because I did the exact same thing at my first one." That broke the tension. A few minutes later, Alyssa learned why they were there. Their 8-year-old son, Caleb, had spent most of the previous year going in and out of hospitals. Brightwell had helped cover transportation, medication, and temporary housing when Ben had to cut his work hours. "There was 1 month," Rachel said, turning her water glass slowly between her hands, "when we were looking at the rent bill and Caleb's prescription and trying to figure out which one could wait." Ben stared down at his plate. Brightwell made sure we did not have to choose. Something inside Alyssa settled. This was why she had come. Not for Graham. Not for the donor photographs. Not to prove she belonged anywhere. She had spent months reading stories like theirs in reports, reviewing program budgets, asking why families were still falling through gaps everyone claimed they wanted to fix. Hearing it in Rachel's voice made every late conference call feel worth it. Across the room, Graham glanced toward table 14. He expected Alyssa to look stranded. Instead, she was laughing at something Dr. Hayes had said. Sloane noticed his attention drift. "You keep checking on her." Graham reached for his wine. "I am not checking on her." "Then what are you doing?" He looked back toward the investors beside him, making sure she does not turn this into something. Sloane raised one eyebrow. "She has barely looked over here." That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Graham had always understood Alyssa's silence as something he could read. If she went quiet, she was hurt. If she smiled politely, she was angry. If she left the room, she needed time. At least that was what he told himself. Then a woman wearing a Brightwell staff badge approached Alyssa's table. "Miss Carter?" Alyssa turned. "Yes." Mr. Price asked if you could join him backstage before the auction. Graham could not hear the words, but he saw the exchange. He saw the staff member lean closer with obvious respect. He saw Alyssa shake her head gently. "Please tell Julian I appreciate it," she said. "But I would rather stay here tonight. This should be about the families." The coordinator smiled as though the answer did not surprise her. "He said you might say that." Alyssa gave a small laugh. Then he knows me too well. The woman walked away. Graham's expression changed. Julian Price did not personally send staff members across a ballroom for random guests. He was chairman of Brightwell, a man whose calls some of Graham's investors waited days to get returned. Sloane followed his stare. Who was that? Graham did not answer. At table 14, Rachel leaned toward Alyssa. You know Julian Price? Alyssa took a sip of water. A little. That was all she said. But 20 feet away, Graham was already doing what insecure men often do when the facts stop matching the story they have told themselves. He was trying to figure out what he had missed. The room shifted just before the auction began. Waiters cleared the dinner plates. The quartet stopped playing, and a brighter wash of light settled over the stage. People straightened in their chairs. Phones came out. This was the part of the evening Graham had been waiting for. A Brightwell executive stepped to the microphone and smiled. Before we begin tonight's auction, we would like to recognize the organizations whose support keeps these programs moving. Applause started before the names were even called. Graham adjusted the front of his jacket and leaned slightly toward Sloane. This is us. She smiled. About time. One by one, company names appeared on the screen behind the stage. $50,000. $75,000. $100,000. Each number drew applause. Then North Star Vale Partners appeared in large white letters. $250,000. Graham rose immediately. Sloane stood beside him. Cameras turned. He shook hands with the man at the next table, then looked toward one of the photographers as if he had practiced the angle. Alyssa watched from the back without expression. Dr. Hayes leaned toward her. That is your former husband, right? Alyssa glanced at him. Yes. He gave Graham a long look, then returned to his coffee. He seems very comfortable being noticed. Alyssa almost smiled. He worked hard at it. Across the ballroom, Graham was doing exactly what he came to do. Richard Cole, a senior investor Graham had been trying to impress for months, stood near the aisle. Graham crossed over before the applause fully faded. Richard, good to see you. Richard shook his hand. Strong contribution. We believe in the mission. Graham said it smoothly. Sloane stepped in beside him. Graham has been pushing North Star to do more in this space. That matters, Richard said. Especially now. Sloane glanced toward the back of the room, and her eyes landed on Alyssa. Maybe it was insecurity. Maybe it was the champagne. Maybe she simply could not resist proving she belonged at Graham's side. It is funny, she said lightly. Graham is generous with everyone. He even made sure his past found a seat somewhere tonight. Richard's smile disappeared first. Graham's did not, but only because he was too slow to understand what had just happened. Alyssa heard it. So did Rachel. So did two people at the neighboring table. The air around table 14 went strangely still. Alyssa set down her fork. She did not look at Sloane. She looked at Graham. For 1 second, their eyes met across the room. He knew she had heard. His face gave away something small and ugly. Not regret. Calculation. He was deciding whether stepping in would make the moment worse for him. That was all Alyssa needed to see. Rachel whispered, I am sorry. Alyssa shook her head. You did not say it. Then a woman from the next table turned around. She was in her early 40s, wearing a navy evening gown and a bright wellboard pin. She studied Alyssa for a moment, then said, Excuse me, are you Alyssa Carter? Alyssa hesitated. Yes. The woman's face changed immediately. Carter Meridian? Graham heard it from several tables away. His shoulders stiffened. Alyssa answered softly, Just Alyssa tonight. The woman smiled in recognition. Of course. I did not realize you were here. Graham was no longer listening to Richard. He was staring at Alyssa now, trying to place two words he had heard before in conference rooms, investor decks, and conversations where people lowered their voices when important money came up. Carter Meridian. He turned to Sloane. Do you know that name? Sloane frowned. Should I? Before he could answer, the ballroom lights dimmed another level. Julian Price walked onto the stage holding a black envelope. The screens behind him went dark. Conversation stopped. Julian waited until the room settled, then said, Before the auction begins, there is one final commitment we need to recognize tonight. Alyssa lowered her eyes for the first time all evening. Graham saw it. And suddenly, for reasons he could not explain, he had the terrible feeling that the next name announced was going to change the entire room. Julian Price waited until the last whisper disappeared. Then he opened the black envelope. Every year, we recognize donors who help us expand care for families who would otherwise fall through the cracks, he said. Tonight, We are announcing the largest multi-year commitment in Brightwell's history. Graham stopped breathing for half a second. Richard Cole had returned to his table, but his attention was fixed on the stage now. Sloane leaned closer to Graham. How large? He did not answer. Julian looked down at the card in his hand. $25 million. The room reacted before the donor's name even appeared. A few people gasped. Someone near the front whispered, "Wow." Then the screen behind Julian changed. Carter Meridian Foundation. $25 million for the Children's Access Endowment. Applause rolled through the ballroom, louder than anything North Star Vale had received minutes earlier. Graham stared at the screen. The name was no longer vaguely familiar. He remembered seeing Carter Meridian in investment reports. Infrastructure funds, private equity holdings, institutional partnerships. The kind of organization people at North Star discussed carefully because one relationship with them could change the trajectory of a firm. That Carter Meridian? Sloane whispered. Graham did not move. Julian raised one hand, and the applause softened. This commitment will fund medication assistance, temporary housing, transportation, and long-term family support across 5 states. At table 14, Rachel covered her mouth. Ben looked at Alyssa, then back at the stage. Alyssa kept her hands folded in her lap. Julian continued. The structure behind this endowment was developed over the past 14 months with someone who insisted, repeatedly, that her personal involvement not become the story. Graham slowly turned toward the back of the ballroom. She asked us to focus on the families, Julian said. But I hope she will forgive me for acknowledging the work she did to make this possible. Alyssa Carter, thank you. Every head near table 14 turned. Rachel whispered, "Oh my God." Dr. Hayes smiled as though he had been waiting for everyone else to catch up. Alyssa exhaled and gave Julian a look that said he would hear about this later, but she stood because remaining seated would only make the moment stranger. The applause rose again. She did not wave dramatically. She simply placed one hand over her heart and nodded. Then Julian looked toward her table and frowned. It was not theatrical. He genuinely seemed confused. "Alyssa," he said into the microphone, "why are you all the way back there?" A nervous ripple moved through the room. Graham's stomach dropped. His eyes shifted to the chair beside him, the one Sloane occupied, then to the small empty space on the table where Alyssa's place card had been. Sloane understood at exactly the same moment. Her face lost its polished smile. Julian glanced toward one of the event coordinators, who looked horrified. "There must have been a seating mistake," he said. Alyssa answered from the back, her voice calm enough to carry through the quiet room. "It is fine, Julian. Please continue." That made it worse for Graham. She did not expose him. She did not explain. She did not need to. Several people had already seen what happened. Richard Cole was one of them. He looked from Alyssa to Graham, then to Sloane, putting the pieces together without anyone saying another word. Julian moved on to the program details, but Graham heard almost none of it. $25 million was not what frightened him most. What frightened him was the realization that Alyssa had been working inside a world he thought she never understood, and she had done it quietly enough that he had never bothered to notice. When the applause finally faded, Richard approached Graham again. This time there was no congratulatory smile. He nodded toward Alyssa. "Your ex-wife?" Graham swallowed. "Yes." Richard looked at him for a long moment. "You were married to Alyssa Carter for 6 years. He paused. "And you never knew?" Richard's question followed Graham long after the man walked away. Not because it was loud, because it was accurate. 6 years. 6 years of shared mornings, tax returns, family holidays, late-night takeout, and arguments about nothing. Yet there were whole rooms inside Alyssa's life he had never bothered to enter. Graham told himself it was because she kept them closed. The truth was less comfortable. He had stopped asking. At the back of the ballroom, Julian finally persuaded Alyssa to join him near the stage after the program ended. She did not stay under the lights. The moment the applause was over, she stepped down and moved toward a quieter corner where several Brightwell staff members were waiting. Graham watched a program director hand her a folder thick with charts and budget summaries. "The pharmacy network approved the revised cap this morning," the woman said. "That gives us another 1,200 families in year 1. Alyssa opened the folder. "Only if transportation stays protected. Do not let them shift that money." "We did not." Good. Graham had heard her speak that way before, but only at home, usually when she was solving someone else's problem. He had mistaken calm for lack of ambition. Now he understood she had simply never needed an audience. Sloane stood beside him with her arms folded. You really did not know? Graham's face tightened. She never talked about her family like that. That is not what I asked. Before he could answer, Richard Cole approached Alyssa. Graham expected a polite introduction. Instead, Richard shook her hand like they had met before. Your allocation model was smart, he said. Especially the 3-year reserve. Alyssa smiled. The reserve was not my idea. Brightwell's finance team caught the risk. You are giving away credit again. I am giving it to the people who did the work. Richard laughed softly. Graham felt something shift in his chest. Not jealousy. Something worse. Recognition. For years, he had told himself Alyssa lacked the instinct for serious rooms. Yet here she was discussing 8-figure funding structures with the same people he spent months trying to get on a calendar. Then came the part he could not explain away. Richard gestured toward the screen. 14 months is a long runway for a donation like this. It had to be, Alyssa said. We started before Brightwell even picked the date for tonight. Graham looked up sharply. Before the gala. Before the seating chart. Before Sloane's joke. Before any reason Alyssa could have had to embarrass him. So this was not revenge. She had not arranged $25 million to make him look small. He had done that himself. Julian joined them with 2 glasses of sparkling water. Your father is going to be pleased when he sees the final structure. Graham heard the word father and stepped closer without thinking. Alyssa noticed him immediately. Her expression did not harden. It simply became careful. Julian looked between them. Graham, right? Yes. Julian nodded politely, then turned back to Alyssa. Marcus called this afternoon. He said to tell you he was proud you kept the housing piece intact. Marcus. The name landed somewhere deep in Graham's memory. Marcus Carter. Meridian Harbor Capital. A man Graham had heard senior partners mention with the kind of respect usually reserved for people who could move markets without raising their voice. Graham looked at Alyssa. Your father is Marcus Carter? The question came out quieter than he intended. Alyssa closed the folder. Yes. Graham stared at her as pieces of the last decade began rearranging themselves. Then Richard, still standing nearby, said something that made the room around Graham seem to narrow. Interesting. Marcus was the one who introduced me to North Star's first institutional backer. Alyssa's eyes moved to Richard immediately. Graham turned toward her. She did not deny it. And suddenly he understood that the $25 million announcement was not the biggest secret Alyssa had kept from him. For a few seconds, Graham said nothing. The ballroom noise seemed to fade behind the blood rushing in his ears. He looked at Alyssa, then at Richard, then back at Alyssa again. You knew? He finally asked. Richard gave him a puzzled look. Knew what? Graham ignored him. You knew Marcus Carter helped open that door for North Star. Alyssa's expression stayed steady. I knew my father agreed to make one introduction. One introduction? Graham gave a short, humorless laugh. That meeting changed everything. The meeting gave you a chance, Alyssa said. What you did with it was yours. That should have made him feel better. It did not. He followed her into the hallway outside the ballroom when she excused herself from the group. The doors closed behind them, muting the applause and conversation inside. Why did you never tell me? He asked. Alyssa stopped near a tall window overlooking the city. Because I did not want you wondering whether people took your calls because of me. So you just let me think I did it all myself? You did do the work, Graham. That is not the point. Then what is the point? He opened his mouth, but the answer sounded worse once he heard it in his own head. The point was that he hated discovering she had occupied a level of influence he had spent years chasing. The point was that he had built part of his identity around believing he had outgrown her. Alyssa saw the realization before he said anything. You are not angry that I kept money from you, she said quietly. You are angry that I knew a world you thought belonged to you. His face hardened. You made me look like a fool tonight. No, her voice stayed low. You gave my seat away before anyone announced $1. He went still. Alyssa continued. You did that when you thought I was just your ex-wife. You did not need to know who my father was to treat me with basic respect. Graham looked toward the ballroom doors. Sloane needed to be close to investors. And I was easier to move. He had no answer. Alyssa reached into her clutch and pulled out the Ivory Place card she had taken from table 7. She held it between them. This is what you thought I was worth tonight. A name you could pick up and move somewhere less important. Graham's eyes dropped to the card. That is not fair. Neither was the marriage by the end. The words landed without anger, which made them harder to dismiss. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. You could have told me who your family was years ago. I told you who I was every day. Alyssa's voice softened, but not with affection. You just stopped thinking that was enough. Before Graham could respond, the ballroom door opened. Sloane stepped into the hallway. She had clearly heard enough to know this was not a conversation she was supposed to interrupt, but she did anyway. So this is what tonight is? She asked Graham. You find out she comes from money, and suddenly you cannot stop following her around. Graham turned. Sloane, not now. Her face changed. That is exactly what you used to say about her. Silence stretched between all three of them. Alyssa looked at Sloane, and for the first time that evening, she saw something other than smug confidence. Doubt. Sloane folded her arms. You told me she hated your ambition. You told me she could not keep up with your world. Graham said nothing. Sloane gave a small nod as if his silence had answered for him. Then she looked at Alyssa. Did he tell you the same kind of things about me? Alyssa did not get the chance to answer. Sloane turned back to Graham. Because I am starting to think the problem was never which woman stood beside you. She paused. It was that you needed whichever woman was there to feel smaller than you. Sloane's words hung in the hallway longer than any accusation Alyssa could have made. Graham looked at her, as if he were searching for the version of the evening he could still control. That is not what this is, he said. Then tell me what it is. Sloane's voice stayed low, but the polished charm she had carried all night was gone. Graham glanced toward Alyssa. Can we not do this here? Sloane gave a small, disbelieving laugh. There it is again. What? You deciding when everyone else is allowed to have a reaction. Alyssa could have walked away. A year ago, she probably would have. She would have told herself their problems were no longer hers. But then Sloane turned to her. He told me you hated these events, she said. He said you thought his work was shallow. He said you were embarrassed by how ambitious he was. Alyssa felt no satisfaction hearing it. Just a strange sadness at how familiar the pattern sounded. I never hated his ambition, she said. I hated what he started using it to excuse. Graham's jaw tightened. Alyssa, she asked me. Sloane looked at him. You also told me she never supported North Star. Graham said nothing. That silence answered more than Alyssa wanted it to. Sloane's eyes sharpened. And now I find out her family helped get your first institutional meeting? It was one introduction, Graham said quickly. Exactly, Alyssa replied. One introduction. He built the company after that. Sloane stared at her. You are defending him? I am telling the truth. Those are not the same thing. For the first time all night, Sloane seemed to look at Alyssa without competition. Then her phone buzzed inside her clutch. She checked the screen and frowned. You have got to be kidding me. Graham's attention snapped toward her. What? She turned the phone so he could see. A photograph from the gala had already been posted by a financial news reporter. Graham and Sloane stood smiling beside the North Star Veil donation screen. Behind them, several tables away, Alyssa could be seen being escorted toward the back of the room. The caption mentioned the $25 million Carter Meridian commitment and identified Alyssa as a member of the Carter family. Comments were already filling in beneath it. Sloane looked up. People saw what happened. Graham took out his own phone. 3 messages arrived almost at once. One from his communications director, one from a North Star partner, and one from Richard Cole. The last was only a sentence. We should revisit Monday's meeting before moving forward. Graham read it twice. His face went pale. Alyssa noticed and immediately understood what he was thinking. Do not blame me for that. I was not. You were about to. He locked the screen. Richard is overreacting. Sloane shook her head. No. Richard is watching how you behave when you think someone in the room cannot help you. That stopped him. It was exactly what Alyssa had been trying to say all night. Sloane stepped back and removed the donor ribbon Graham had pinned to her dress earlier. She placed it on the narrow console table beside the ballroom doors. I came here because I thought we were building something, she said. But I am not interested in becoming the next woman you describe as dead weight when someone more useful walks in. Sloane, come on. No, she picked up her coat check ticket. You told me Alyssa could not keep up with you. I think you needed that story because the truth made you uncomfortable. Then she walked toward the elevators without another word. Graham did not follow. For once, he seemed unable to decide which loss required his attention first. His phone kept vibrating in his hand. North Star. Richard. His communications team. But his eyes went to Alyssa. I did not know any of this, he said. Alyssa slipped the place card back into her clutch. That was never the problem, Graham. She turned toward the ballroom. Inside, Rachel and Ben were waiting to say goodbye, and Julian was speaking with a group of physicians near the stage. Alyssa had people she actually wanted to finish the evening with. Graham called after her. "Can we talk before you leave?" She stopped but did not turn around. There was a long pause. Then she said, "If you finally want to talk about us instead of what my last name can do for you, you have until my car gets here." By the time Alyssa stepped through the hotel's revolving doors, the night air felt colder than she expected. Manhattan moved around her without caring what had happened upstairs. Taxis rolled past. A delivery bike cut through traffic. Somewhere down the block, someone laughed too loudly outside a restaurant. Real life had already moved on. Graham came through the doors a few seconds later, leaving the noise of the gala behind him. For once, he did not look like a man entering a room he expected to control. He stopped a few feet away. "I am sorry." Alyssa looked at him. There had been a time when those words would have opened something inside her immediately. Tonight, they simply made her wait for what came next. Graham glanced toward the street. "Not just about the chair. About Sloane. About the way I talked about you after we separated. About making you feel like you were standing in the way of the life I wanted." Alyssa said nothing. He swallowed. "I kept telling myself we grew apart." "We did." "No," Graham shook his head. "I moved the finish line every time I got close to something I wanted. And every time you did not chase it with me, I decided that meant you lacked ambition." He looked back toward the hotel. "Tonight, I watched people listen to you without you trying to impress them. I realized I spent years trying to become the kind of person you never needed to pretend to be." Alyssa felt the old ache of their marriage, but it no longer had the power to pull her backward. "You know what hurt the most?" she asked. Graham waited. "It was never that you did not know about my family. I wanted a marriage where my last name did not matter. I wanted to know that if all I had was myself, that would still be enough for the person beside me." His eyes dropped. "It should have been." "Yes." The answer was gentle. That made it final. Graham stepped closer, but not enough to touch her. "Is there any version of this where we talk again?" "Not tonight. Someday." Alyssa studied the man she had once planned her whole life around. She did not hate him. That surprised her most. Hate would have meant he was still taking up too much space. "Maybe someday we can talk," she said. Hope flickered across his face, but she continued. "But do not confuse forgiveness with another chance." His expression changed. Alyssa reached into her clutch and found the place card she had carried all evening. Her name stared back at her in black letters and gold trim. Such a small thing. Earlier, it had felt like proof that Graham could still decide where she belonged. Now it was just paper. The hotel doors opened behind them, and Julian hurried outside. "Alyssa," he held up one hand. "You forgot this at the registration table." It was another copy of her place card, the original seating list still clipped behind it. Alyssa laughed softly at the absurdity. Julian smiled. "I suppose we owe you a better seat next year." She looked at the card, then handed it back. "Recycle it." Julian raised an eyebrow. Alyssa glanced toward Graham before turning back to him. "I think I am done letting people tell me where I belong." Her car pulled to the curb. Nothing flashy. Just the sedan she had scheduled hours earlier, before anyone knew how the night would end. Graham opened his mouth as if there were one more thing he wanted to say, but Alyssa was grateful when he did not. Some apologies deserve to be heard. They do not all deserve to become doorways back into your life. She got into the car and watched the hotel disappear behind her as they turned onto the avenue. Upstairs, her family's name was still glowing across a giant screen. But that was not what made her feel powerful. Money had not given Alyssa her value. Public recognition had not restored it. Graham's regrets certainly had not created it. Her value had been there when she helped him build his first pitch deck. It had been there when he chose someone else. It had been there when she sat near the kitchen doors and listened to a mother talk about choosing between rent and medicine. The world had simply caught up to something Alyssa finally understood for herself. The people who respect you only after they discover what you own never truly respected you. And sometimes the greatest revenge is not watching someone regret losing you. It is reaching the point where their regret no longer decides what you do next.